Chapter 3. The Castle's Remnants.
She could feel the deep pounding in her chest, pumping blood through her veins as the adrenaline took over. She couldn't breathe. She gasped for air as she attempted to claw away at the darkness that suffocated her. She could feel the slimy, grotesque strings of malice seeping into her throat. It clung to her, draining her power, along with the comforting feeling she had felt for the last 100 years. She could sense that she wasn't alone, as if others were there to offer their own experience to her in order to keep her power strong. But there was still only so much they could do, that she could do. His influence was seeping not just inside of her, but out through the weakening barrier that she had kept up for so long. Her grasp was losing strength. It was as if she could feel the oozing malice trickling through her fingers and into the outside world, causing the increase in the monster's strength. She was failing. The Calamity would break free at any moment. The fields, the trees, and the people she loved so much would be soon trampled. She didn't want that. A vivid image of the pig-like cloud flew through her mind. It had done it once, it could do it again. It would do it again. It will do it again. The beast's roar echoed through her mind, yet in the far-off distance, she could hear it. Laughter. A faint yet familiar laughter of a man that had cursed her for so long. For years, for centuries, for every different era and time. She would fail, just as her plans had failed before. His laughter rang louder. The remaining lives in Hyrule would be taken, including the knight who had served her for so long. The knight who had so recently just died in her arms. She felt her throat begin to bloat with malice. She could feel the tears form in the corner of her eyes as she gagged, fighting to keep her grasp and breathe at the same time. The laughter grew even louder. He would win. It was over. She was ready to give in, to allow the darkness to take her. It was only a matter of time. She could see his blackened face before it changed, revealing a corrupted, red-maned face that was so close to hers. She closed her eyes, wishing for it to disappear, but she could still see it, watching her struggle, waiting for her to break. She choked.
No!
Zelda bolted up from the ground, still keeping her eyes tightly shut to avoid looking into Ganon's evil orange eyes. She swung her right arm up. She had to keep her power strong. She couldn't allow him to break free. She could see it through her eyelids, the bright golden power shining from the back of her hand. It felt warm and soothing against her skin. It had been so long since her power had been able to cover the Calamity's frigid and slimy aura. Still, she was worried. Even if her power had gained strength, he had weakened it before, and he would do it again. She couldn't let her guard down for even a moment. She had to focus. She could no longer hear his laughter. However, another sound now echoed in her ears. A chirping sound. One she had almost forgotten about.
But...
Zelda attempted to open her eyes, only to be blinded by the bright light she had thought to be her own power. Keeping her right hand high, she used her free arm to wipe her eyes before slowly beginning to open them again. The light blinded her once more. However, she forced her eyes to stay open as her vision slowly returned, revealing the back of her hand that she had kept raised. Rays of light shone through her fingers, yet the odd, incandescent symbol that had appeared upon her skin had vanished. This was not her power. Slowly and cautiously, Zelda lowered her hand, wincing at the increase of light before staring in awe at the expanse of blue above her. A pair of flying creatures flew across the seemingly endless space, subconsciously causing her eyes to track their progress. She saw puffs of white drifting aimlessly as a gentle breeze lightly caressed her body. She couldn't believe it. It almost felt as if she didn't even remember that it had looked like this. She hadn't seen the sky in so long. She slowly pushed herself to her feet and looked over the edge of the yellow, stone-crafted tower and out across the lands. There she could see the grass of the green fields flowing in the breeze, small ponds lightly rippling, and the leaves of the trees dancing to their own rhythm. She looked beyond the fields and gazed at the mountains, which were nearly invisible in the brilliance of the risen sun behind them. Everything seemed to have a glow to it, from every blade of grass carpeting the field to every leaf that sprouted from the tree's highest branches. This was her home. She was in Hyrule, outside of her tower. At this thought, Zelda's eyes slowly made their way to the eerie structure where she had been self-imprisoned. Similar to the mountains, the front of Hyrule Castle was shrouded in shadows. Still, even with its looming figure, Its aura was different. No longer did it have the dome of evil corrupting it. The 3 pillars stationed around the castle had dulled, and there was no sign of the pig-like cloudy beast that used to fly around its towers. The castle, her home, looked to be just as she was, free. She took in a large breath of what she felt was the freshest air she had ever had before slowly exhaling. Her eyes began to water and burn, but she didn't care. She didn't want to close her eyes. She didn't want to risk the sight disappearing in case it was just a figment of her imagination. Soon, however, her eyes forced themselves to close, only for her to open them back up to see the same view she had only seconds before. Her mouth hung slightly agape as reality sunk in, and her memories returned from the night prior. It wasn't a dream. They truly had defeated the Calamity. She was truly released from her prison. Continuing to stare out over the landscape, Zelda gave an awkward, relieved giggle.
Oh, Link, we really did it. I'm really here with you on this tower in our kingdom, freed from everything. Can you believe it? The Calamity's gone. It's really...
Zelda paused as she turned around to face the interior of the Sheikah Tower to see Link's happy face, but he was nowhere on the tower floor. She furrowed her brow as she turned her attention to the corner he had been resting in the night before. His blanket was folded, and the Master Sword had disappeared without a trace. She knew he wouldn't leave her here without saying anything. It wasn't like him. A strange feeling of worry began to fill her chest. Even if he had, it wasn't as if he wouldn't come back. He had always come back, and yet she couldn't help but feel uneasy. She bit the inside of her lip before beginning to walk towards the entrance carved through the tower's floor. She needed to find him. Just as she crouched to start climbing down the steps of the center entrance, a blue light caught the corner of her eye. It started as one strand that had flown through the roof, and then 2, and then a third. Soon a multitude of bright blue light strands began to bundle and clump together as Zelda watched in awe. They twirled and weaved before forming a torso, a pair of arms and legs, and finally a head. In a flash, the body finalized before returning to its usual color, revealing a dirty but bright blue tunic and a purple sword accented with a blue and gold sheath on its back. His sandy hair was mostly tied back except for his bangs and sideburns, which swayed in the breeze as he turned his head towards the spot on the ground where Zelda had been sleeping. His face hardened when he saw that the princess he had left behind wasn't there. Apparently having the same idea as her, Link turned toward the hole in the floor only for his eyes to land upon Zelda with her leg half hanging out of it. His face instantly softened.
I thought I had lost you again. Where are you off to?
I was off to find you. Usually you would tell me when you were going somewhere alone, or at least back then you did. I knew you would come back, but where did you go?
I'm sorry. I figured that you haven't eaten in 100 years, and there isn't a cooking pot up here in the tower. I went down into the forest to use the one your father's spirit had left behind.
I see.
Carefully, Zelda pulled her leg back up from the floor hole. Stepping forward, Link offered his hand, to which the princess accepted. After being pulled to her feet, she dusted herself off as best she could before clearing her throat. Having returned to his blank features, Link stared at her calmly.
Is everything all right?
She hesitated, knowing there was a deeper reason for her nerves. She also knew it would be much simpler to ask about what she was worried about. Despite knowing this, out of fear of what he would say, she simply shook her head and smiled.
I just, thought it would be rude of me to ask what you had cooked down there.
Link stared at her face as she remained smiling. She could feel the piercing blue eyes examining her. She felt something creep around her heart, the fear that he would see through her just as he did only a moment earlier. Thankfully, though it seemed like he did want to question her further, Link's face softened again.
I think that's a fair question to have for someone who hasn't eaten in as long as you have. Are you afraid I got experimental?
Should I be?
Not at all. I promise, really. It's just a simple creamy meat soup. I added a little extra rock salt to the broth to give the taste a bit more strength. I hope that doesn't bother you.
Not in the slightest.
Zelda said that, choosing to leave out that she could currently eat even dubious food if she truly had to. She would do anything to rid herself of the burning taste of malice that haunted her throat, even if she had only felt it in what she hoped was a dream. Moving back to their original area on the tower, they settled back down before Link pulled the Sheikah slate from his belt. He began to look through its screens, and after only a moment of searching, with a tap, the bowls formed on the floor in front of him from a bundle of the same blue strings of light that had constructed him earlier. After securing the slate back onto his belt, he took both of the bowls in hand, holding one of them out for Zelda to take. Out of habit, Zelda attempted to prepare her hands before her meal and wiped them against herself. However, she quickly realized how futile it was when her palms only became dirtier at the touch of her soiled dress. 100 years ago, this would have bothered her slightly, but after all she had been through, she couldn't have cared less now. Shrugging off her stained hands, she reached out and took the bowl of soup. It was still warm, something she could only assume was possible by the Sheikah slate keeping it fresh in its storage. The two began to eat, and even though it was in silence, Zelda began to feel at ease. The atmosphere around Link was one she had dearly missed, more than she had realized. It was warm and welcoming, the complete opposite of the cold and vicious Calamity, who fought to tear itself away from her grasp, a grasp she herself didn't want to hold. Hoping that he didn't notice, she kept her eyes on him as they ate, watching as he somewhat scarfed down his food. She smiled. He was doing his best to slow down so as not to disgust her with his poor manners, just as he had done when they were together before. Little did he know that she actually enjoyed it when he ate in his usual fashion. He was the first person to treat her as a real friend before the Calamity had struck. Back then, everyone had always kept their distance from her, and it wasn't a mystery as to why. She was the princess of the kingdom, despite being considered the failure of the royal family. Even if she would never measure up to the late queen, a princess was a princess. That would never change. Despite knowing this, she felt lonely. She had lost her mother, and due to the news of the Calamity and the duty that had been thrust upon her at such a young age, her father kept his distance from her as well. She was always away, with a pair of silent guards to watch over her as she prayed. Though Urbosa would accompany her every now and then, more often than not, she might as well have been alone. It wasn't until Link was appointed to her that her loneliness began to fade. Though it started out as a rocky relationship, one that was admittedly her fault, it had developed into one of care and understanding. The Silent Knight, known for saying little to nothing at all, had lowered his emotional defenses around her, even if just a little. Zelda smiled at the memories of them together, bonding during their travels. This smile hadn't gone unnoticed by Link.
Do you like it? I figured you'd enjoy anything after 100 years of nothing.
Oh, yes. Even if I hadn't gone without eating anything in so long, it's still delicious. Your cooking talent never went away, even after your memory loss.
Well, with a glutton such as myself, it might as well be a survival skill.
With a full breath, he lifted his knee in order to rest one of his elbows on it. Placing his other elbow on the wall of the tower, he placed his chin in his palm as he stared out over the landscape, just as Zelda had done earlier. She watched as his bangs continued to sway in the breeze, constantly covering and revealing his oceanic eyes in tease. While she felt generally at ease with both his presence and the memories of their time spent together, it was these same memories that played into her hidden fears. While it seemed extremely insensitive, especially after only being reunited for a night, the urge to ask was constantly growing. She wanted to know. She had to know. Wrapping her fingers against the sides of the bowl she held and attempting to ignore the growing warmth in her cheeks, she quietly cleared her throat while placing her bowl on the floor.
Link, may I, ask you something?
By all means.
How much do you remember about us?
Link's eyes widened slightly at her question. He seemed to have expected it, though it had come much sooner than anticipated. He glanced over at Zelda, keeping his chin in his hands as he inspected her slightly blushing face, before looking back out into the fields.
Well, probably...
Before he could properly answer, a rumbling of the tower had stopped him. The shutter had come by surprise, along with a booming crash paired with the sharp snapping of trees down below. While Zelda, startled by the sudden commotion, turned her entire body and peered off the tower's edge in fear, Link simply raised his head and looked out towards the forest where he had done his cooking, watching as a flock of panicked birds were now flying away.
Don't worry, it's most likely the stone talus that made its home in the Forest of Spirits. I must have awakened it when I entered the forest to cook. I didn't think it would still be searching for me, much less get upset at all.
A stone talus? That's not much of a challenge for you, is it?
Not at all, especially not that one. It was a different story when I first woke up and ran into it. It caught me by surprise back then, but it's practically nothing to me now. I'll go take care of it.
Take care of it? As in right now? But, Link, you're still injured. Are you sure you should be fighting, even if it is something so simple?
I'll be fine. Still, it is something I'm worried about.
Something you're worried about?
I was thinking about this last night after you fell asleep, but don't you think it's weird? The Calamity should be sealed, and yet...
Monsters are still roaming around. I saw monsters when I visited my father's cabin last night before you had reawakened, but I didn't think much about it since they were fairly normal even back then, but now that I think about it... Do you think something went wrong with the seal?
I should be asking you, if I'm being honest. I'd kinda hoped after 100 years of using it, you might understand your power a bit more.
I unfortunately don't. The knowledge left as soon as it came. It honestly didn't even feel like I was the one using the power. It felt as though I was being guided by someone the entire time.
Someone?
I know it sounds strange, but I don't quite understand that part either. Right now, I can't even feel my power. Even last night, I needed to sneak past the bokoblins to get to the cabin. I guess I'm back to being a useless princess. I'm sorry.
Zelda kept her head lowered in disappointment. Link's features softened as he realized he had gone into what he thought of as adventure mode. Standing, he stepped forward before crouching down in front of her, causing her to lift the head she had lowered at his closeness. He gave her a faint smile.
You have nothing to apologize for. You kept that thing at bay for 100 years. It's no surprise you wouldn't feel it. You're trained. Don't feel bad. I was being insensitive. Still, I can't ignore that you ventured to the cabin last night after seeing those monsters, especially after hearing that you can't activate your powers. You need to be more careful, okay?
Zelda's face dropped further into disappointment. It really was the same as before. She was completely useless. Slightly lowering her head once more, she nodded. Recognizing her pain, Link looked back out towards the forest and attempted to move past the quick condemnation he had given her.
It's just an idea, but I think the blood moon had something to do with it.
The blood moon? But the last blood moon was almost a month ago.
No. You may have been too focused on sealing Ganon that you didn't notice, but he summoned a final one before charging at you. Don't you think that's also weird?
Not necessarily. He was practically beaten before he charged at me. It was most likely a sign of desperation. Wouldn't you agree?
I'm not so sure. I mean, if I were fighting for my last chance at life, wouldn't I want all my power to focus on the one person that can destroy me? I thought he'd risen the Blood Moon to enhance his strength, but if he simply resummoned the monsters around Hyrule...
Then he actually chose to spread his malice back across the land. That is a bit odd when you put it that way. But for what purpose if he himself is no longer around?
The two sat in silence, contemplating the questions that now loomed over their heads. Zelda couldn't help but begin to feel guilty. While Link hadn't come out and explicitly said it, she knew he was wondering if her seal had failed at containing all of the malice. While she didn't understand why Ganon would have spread his influence across Hyrule instead of facing her completely, the fact still remained that it had escaped her reach. Another thing to add to her list of failures. Depressed, Zelda raised the bowl to her lips and took a sip. This time, however, the taste of malice hadn't washed away. After a minute or so of silence, Link pushed himself back up from his crouching position, starting to adjust the legendary blade that sat on his back.
Well, we won't get anywhere just sitting here thinking about it. Before I leave, I have one last question for you.
Yes?
Where did you wish to go after this?
What do you mean?
Did you want to head to Kakariko Village to see Impa? We could go to the Lost Woods to see the Great Deku Tree, or... Oh, maybe you'd like to rest for a bit before seeing anyone. I have a, small place we can stay at if you'd like.
Zelda's eyes filled with relief as the fear in her chest settled down. He was referring to their next steps after the tower. While she honestly wanted to go to the small place that he had mentioned for reasons other than simple rest, she knew her conscience wouldn't forgive her if she went there first.
I think it would be best if we paid a visit to Impa. It would be beyond rude of me to not go see her after worrying her for 100 years. Wouldn't you agree?
I can't argue with that. Then, after I defeat the Talus, I'm gonna go clear out Hyrule Castle.
What? But why? What does that have to do with our visit to Impa?
I'm assuming there are things in there you want to grab. Stuff that was left behind. I can think of one book specifically you might want. Two, actually. Now that the Calamity is gone, the castle will be a prime target for thieves and looters. I'd rather you get what you need out of there before it's ransacked.
He looked down to meet Zelda's eyes, something that only made the burn in her cheeks return.
Do you think you can handle going there after, you know?
I can, but must you go alone? I know I don't have my power, but I could at least be somewhat useful, couldn't I?
Zelda, you just finished sealing the Calamity. Not to mention, you don't know how to fight. And you're in a prayer dress.
But, Link, even so...
Can you climb around in that dress?
Well, no, but...
Can you swing a sword, shoot a bow, or block with a shield? Can you do any of those things?
Again, no, but...
Zelda.
His voice had hardened at the last call of her name. There really was nothing she could do. She would only be a burden to him if he had to protect her the entire time. Just as before, Zelda lowered her head, choosing instead to lock her eyes on the remainder of the soup she had in her bowl. Link's voice, recognizing her silent admittance to defeat, had softened.
I'm sorry. You'll probably feel another rumble in a few moments. I'm gonna use a few bomb arrows on that Talus. I'll be back soon, and then we can go gather your belongings from the castle together. Alright?
Zelda nodded without looking up. Though she didn't see it, Link gave her a faint smile. Taking the Sheikah slate from his belt, after a few taps of the screen, a paraglider formed from the blue lights. With one last glance over at Zelda, he stepped off the tower's edge and soared down towards the forest in the distance.
Useless once again. I hate this. I can't stay like this, otherwise I'll just be a burden. I have to change.
Zelda berated herself as she lifted her head and looked back toward the forest. Just as Link had warned, the tower rumbled slightly as she heard the faint sounds of explosions in the distance, causing the broth in her bowl to ripple.
I have to.
The castle creaked and groaned as the wind blew around its crippled towers. What was once full of monsters, corrupted machines, and the gunge of malice had now been replaced with silence. All that remained was the rubble and destruction, a ghost of the former glory once proudly displayed 100 years ago. Like the rest of the castle, Zelda's bedroom, once clean and organized, was now dusty and decayed. The floors were covered in rotting banners and debris from the stone that had fallen from the walls and roof. The bed had collapsed in on itself. The staircase in the center of the room was practically missing, and all of the wooden furniture in the room had fallen apart and rotted away. This was heartbreaking to the bedroom's owner, who couldn't help but frown at the sight. While she had told herself not to expect much, there was no way for her to prepare for the sight of her demolished childhood sanctuary. Quietly, her knight remained behind her, observing her every move as she stepped deeper inside the ruin. Slowly, avoiding the splintered remains of what looked to be a tea table, she arrived at her desk, where burned papers and books lay strewn, completely unrecognizable to her. There was only one book that, surprisingly, survived almost untouched, open and ready to be read by any who dared set foot into the dangers of the castle. Carefully, the owner of the book lightly brushed her fingers against the soiled pages before finally finding the will to speak.
Link, be honest with me. This isn't the first time you visited my room, is it?
Link, who had chosen to stand near the balcony under the bridge connecting the other half of her room, took a deep, silent breath before answering.
No, it's not. One of the pictures you left me happened to be on the bridge to your study. I ended up visiting here to take any gear that might have been lying around. You had a pretty good bow sitting above the fireplace. I'm sorry.
I see. If I may ask another question, did you read this?
Though his face remained blank, a sweat drop fell from his brow as he shifted awkwardly. Unfortunately for him, he couldn't stare into Zelda's emerald eyes without confessing.
I did.
Zelda remained quiet, her eyes unreadable in the shadow of the room. Gingerly, she brought the book up to her chest, dust sprinkling from the pages. Slowly, she stepped from behind the desk and stopped in front of him. With slightly shaky hands, she held the book out to him.
Can you put this into the slate and, please, don't read it again?
Yeah, I won't. I promise.
Thank you. There really is nothing left here, is there?
Would you like me to be honest?
Glancing at him, now watching as he took the slate off of his hip, the princess nodded, fully knowing what his answer would be. After allowing the diary to turn into blue light strings, disappearing into the slate, Link spoke again.
If I had to take a guess, probably not. But I believe Impa may be the one to consult with.
Zelda hummed in response, unable to find a tone that would hide the crippling grief that was growing inside of her. Link's brow slightly furrowed as he watched her slowly glide across her room, taking in every inch of the destruction, remembering what once was. He began to look around on his own, taking in the travesty of lost time. It was vague, but he could still remember what it had originally looked like, especially with the princess here to remind him of the past. With the slightest of exhales, he thought it would best to give her a moment of solitude in her old room and turned away from the interior. Stepping over the rubble, he walked onto the balcony and stood, watching the morning clouds slowly pass by above them. After a few minutes, however, his eyes traveled from the clouds to the bridge high above where he stood. After glancing back to see if Zelda was all right, though she hadn't been paying him much mind while she focused on her lost property, he leaped up and scaled the wall, landing on the upper bridge. It had only been a few hours since he had been here when he cleared out all the guardians earlier that morning, and yet something always felt strange about this bridge. He remembered the time he was with Zelda, casually in her room near the study before her father interrupted her speech. The king never seemed to mind when Link was in the princess's private study, something he had always been grateful for. Whether it was because he was hyper-focused on the return of the Calamity, or if he simply approved of him being so close with Zelda, he didn't know. What he did know was that he always felt as though he had forgotten something here, something else that happened on this bridge. Shaking his head slightly, Link pushed the thought out of his mind. No matter how often he tried to remember, it was always just out of reach. With a deep breath to relax his muddled thoughts, he made his way across the bridge and entered the cluttered and debris-filled study tower it connected to. Shelves and desks had been covered or destroyed with boulder-sized stone wall fragments. Wooden beams were splintered, and plants had either died or preserved into an overgrown mess that clung to the walls. Yet, despite all the destruction, the back wall with the main desk remained untouched. It was most certainly dirty, but the desk and chair, the vials and jars, and all the other knickknacks that lined the stone shelving against that particular wall were surprisingly still intact and properly displayed. Stoically, Link reached out and glided his fingers gently along the large parchment, tools, and candle holders on the surface of the wooden desk. For the most part, while the paper remained intact, anything that had been written upon it had become faded and unreadable, except for the handwritten entries that had been scribbled into the small journal that remained open. Taking a fairly large risk after the request Zelda had made of him about her diary, he took the book into his hands and lifted it up, reading the first few pages. A small smile appeared on his face. Zelda loved her research, and though she only got to do little experiments or follow along and listen as best she could to Robbie or Purah back then, any little bit of detail that caught her attention, no matter how small, would be written in those pages. Giving the lightest chuckle, he reached down to his belt and, just as he had done with the diary, stored the journal in the Sheikah slate. After a bit, the slate's inventory had filled with whatever little tools he deemed still worth taking, such as a microscope, a miniature telescope displayed on the shelf above, and a few other little tools. Determining that was all that would be sentimental or useful to Zelda, he began to turn towards the exit, ready to return to her, but stopped. Out of the corner of his eye, he had noticed the hint of a sparkle near some debris against the wall. Looking down, he noticed a plant different from the rest, a flower, one with a long stem and beautiful blue and white petals. It was an ancient flower, one that had become quite rare, something he had been informed by Zelda herself 100 years ago. After a pause, he made to leave, knowing that it would possibly agitate her if he took it from its stem. They were already considered endangered 100 years ago. Yet, this thought made Link pause once again. He looked back at the plant one last time before making a decision.
Hey.
He had called out to the princess once he made his way back to the lower level of the bedroom. Zelda, who had still been lost in thought as she examined the interior of a cobweb-covered wardrobe filled with dress remains, looked over to see him climbing back over the rubble and into the room.
Oh, forgive me. I had been a bit lost in thought. Did you leave?
Yeah. The staircase to your study had been destroyed, so I took the time to climb up and get anything that wasn't too deteriorated.
Climbing up the side of a castle wall. You've always been such a strange knight, you know? Was there anything left?
More than you would think, but probably not as much as you would prefer.
Well, that's better than nothing, right?
She turned away from her knight, trying to hide her disappointment. Thankfully, Link had prepared for this.
I actually have something that might interest you. I ask you to try and not be too upset when you see it.
Gently, he pulled the flower from the study out from the back of his belt and held it up for her to see. Zelda's eyes brightened with admiration for the flower's beauty, but the sparkle was soon replaced with that of displeasure. With a frown, she gently took the flower away from him.
Link, why would you pull a silent princess from out of the ground? I believe I told you before that they are an endangered species.
Well, about that, I found that one growing in your study just now.
My study? That shouldn't be a healthy environment for this to grow in, especially with how strong the Calamity's influence was, and still is, here. How could such a difficult flower that wouldn't even grow in the best controlled environments grow here, of all places?
Well, I think it's because of you. You know, there's a ton of these growing where you had laid the Master Sword to rest, and, to no surprise, the place you would usually spend your free time. I think the flower grows in response to where you are, or at least...
My power's presence.
The Master Sword is heavily connected to you in some way, right? There were quite a few surrounding it at the sword's pedestal in the forest, and still do. Maybe the Calamity's influence did hinder its ability to grow here in the castle, but a piece of you kept shining through. Just enough for at least one to grow.
Zelda looked up from the flower, meeting Link's eyes as he looked at her with a gentle smile.
I like that theory, though I'm sure it'll need a little bit of testing to prove it. I can't help but ask, what made you think of it? You didn't usually take note of things like this, much less come up with theories of your own.
Well, you learn a lot when you're on the road. You need to learn to adapt, and part of adapting is learning. I guess a piece of you always stayed with me.
You're very kind.
I mean it. You were always watching, right?
As well as I could, but you know I didn't see everything.
Then you were with me, and that helped. It's pretty fun experimenting with things. I see why you enjoy it so much. It really came in handy with improving my cooking, you know.
Zelda raised an eyebrow, to which Link suddenly frowned.
Don't. The dubious food was an unfortunate creation.
That you continued to eat!
Link grumbled, mumbling something about desperate times that only made Zelda giggle harder. Slowly, the small smile reappeared on his features, glad that his intention to cheer her up had gone smoothly.
It's good to have you back, Zelda.
He hadn't meant for that sentence to pass his lips. Zelda's laughter paused as her eyes reconnected with his own. They stared at each other in silence as her cheeks began to flush with color once more. After a few moments passed, Zelda cleared her throat and looked away.
Yes, well, thank you. It's good to be back. It's good to have you back as well.
After another few moments of silence, Zelda scanned the room one last time, then turned back to Link, blank-faced once more.
Well, I believe there's nothing else in here worth taking. Shall we be off to Kakariko?
Actually, there's one more thing we need to pick up. If you choose to bring it along with you.
Why are we in the library?
They had entered a magnificent part of the castle. Though it had deteriorated just as much as the rest of the structure, its opulence was still recognizable. The elegantly crafted ceiling was patterned with a beautiful red, with the carpets across the tile floors in the same shade. Multiple tables were placed throughout the library for extensive reading sessions, and between each tall column was a gigantic bookshelf full of old books, most of which were left to rot.
Link, I know I like books, but I don't think these would be of much use to me. What could possibly be here for me to take? I don't believe we have the time to search through every one of these shelves.
Link remained quiet, simply continuing forward, Zelda following in his wake. Apprehensive, Zelda grew quiet as they neared the opposite side of the library. She expected him to guide her up the flight of stairs that wrapped around the final bookshelf and lead her out of the building, yet Link stopped just before they could. He looked up at the bookshelf situated further away from all the others. While most of it seemed just like all the others, part of the shelf was covered by glass doors. After a moment of hesitation, he brought up a hand and pressed his palm against the glass before turning to the princess who had been following him.
It's up to you what you wish to do with this information.
Taking the Sheikah slate from his belt, Zelda furrowed her eyes in confusion as he began tapping the screen.
Link, honestly, what's gotten into you? What do you...
Zelda cut her words short, distracted as Link raised the slate up. With a snapping sound that echoed throughout the library walls, a beam of light, almost rainbow in color, had connected to the bookshelf. Confused, Zelda took a step back in surprise as Link pulled the large bookshelf away from the wall with the slate's magnetic pull.
I don't understand. This isn't a regular bookshelf. What is this?
She turned her gaze away from the now moved shelf to see an open space where it had been. A room had been revealed, one that she had never seen before. Ignoring the snapping sound of Link releasing the bookshelf from the magnesis rune, Zelda slowly stepped inside what appeared to be a little study area. Against one wall was a simple table with a large stand holding an enormous burned book next to it. On the opposing wall, however, was a desk where an old journal rested open on its surface. Carefully stepping closer to the desk, she leaned down and inspected the journal for a brief moment before looking back at Link, who stood silently in the doorway. He gave a simple nod towards the open pages. Hesitantly, Zelda sat at the desk and took the journal into her hands. She began reading the handwritten words, her face conveying every emotion, from realizing who owned the journal to the utter despair she felt the further she read. Eventually, Link stepped away from the study's doorway, giving Zelda some privacy. He moved to the side and turned his back to the bookcase, looking out into the elongated room. Before long, the princess reappeared, clutching the journal in her arms. Link couldn't help but notice the dried tear streaks that stained her cheeks. Still, she gave a small smile as she wiped a few tears away from the corners of her eyes.
You really have a habit of reading people's diaries, don't you?
Old habits are hard to break, I guess. I'm sorry.
No, Link, Thank you. Truly.
Unable to find any meaningful words to say, he simply nodded. Suddenly, in a moment of bravery, Link raised his hand and placed it softly on her back. Zelda jolted, surprised at the sudden touch. She looked back at his arm before meeting his eyes. With a nod of her own, she held the book out to him. Understanding, he took the book, and after a few taps, it too had vanished into a string of lights into the slate screen. The two Hylians looked back at the looming castle as they stood on the bridge outside its gate. Sun shone through the highest tower while the rest of the castle was shadowed in darkness. Saddened, Zelda lowered her head before looking over at Link. Slowly she nodded, confirming that there was nothing more she needed from their crippled home. In agreement, they turned and began walking across the bridge toward the city remains, ready to start their journey to Kakariko. Suddenly, however, both stopped in their tracks and turned to face the castle. Silently, both could have sworn they had felt something warm and familiar, and yet, no matter how long they stared at the Sanctum Tower, nothing was there.
I have been told my Zelda went to the Spring of Wisdom. This will likely be her last chance. If she is unable to awaken her power at Lanayru, all hope is truly lost. If she comes back without success, then I shall speak kindly with her. Scolding is pointless now. I forced 10 years of training on her. And after all that, it seems her power will stubbornly awaken another way. Perhaps I should encourage her to keep researching her beloved relics. They may just lead her to answers I can't provide. For now, I sit anxiously, more a father than a king in this moment. I sit and await my daughter's return.